So welcome and thank you for attending this afternoon's discussion with Jenny Schuetz. My name is Martin Johnson and I'm a member of the group Next, Chapel Hill, Carrboro. Next is a volunteer-led organization that advocates for a sustainable, resilient, equitable community. Among other things, we support walkable urbanism, transportation alternatives, and housing affordability. If you would like to support our work, please visit our website and consider making a donation. We're currently in a fundraising campaign to support activities like this one. I also hope that you're able to join us on Thursday for a discussion of today's talk and Jenny Schuetz's book, which can be purchased at Epilogue, which will be on Thursday afternoon at 4 p.m. So here's the book. And I'll put the Zoom link in the chat at the end of today's conversation, and I will email everyone who expressed interest in attending that discussion. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Jenny Schuetz for a conversation on her new book and her research on housing. Before I introduce her, I wanted to thank Next member Stephen Whitlow, who organized this afternoon's event. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, Stephen's not able to join us. We'll start with about 30 minutes of questions that we've prepared in advance, followed by a 5-minute lightning round in which Dr. Schuetz will give short answers addressing some of the most common myths around housing. We'll then have 20 minutes for questions from the audience, which you can ask using the chat feature or via unmuting yourself. So Jenny Schuetz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and an expert in urban economics and housing policy. Dr. Schuetz has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. Dr. Schuetz has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the PBS NewsHour, the Indicator podcast, Vox, and Slate. And also most recently, the author of Fixer Upper, How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. Before joining Brookings, Dr. Schuetz served as a principal economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She was also an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and earned a PhD in public policy from Harvard University and a master's in city planning from MIT. So welcome. So I'll start with the question about the book's title. So why do you identify American housing systems rather than just the housing market as being broken?
Thanks for having me. Great first question. So it's important to understand that housing as not just a purely market-driven phenomenon. Housing is actually one of the most regulated industries in the US. So if we think about, in order to get permission to build new housing, the local government has to provide approval. The funding comes mostly from agencies that are regulated by the federal government. So I think it's important to start off not assuming that what we're observing is the market doing its thing and doing it badly, but we have created many layers of policies and regulations, taxes and subsidies, many of which actually are not helpful to housing affordability and impede the market from producing better outcomes. So some of what we want to do is identify sort of how the market would work by itself and then how we can enhance that, but also ways in which existing policies are distorting outcomes and getting bad outcomes.
So can you talk a bit about what it would mean for a housing market or system to be healthy? And what are some of the key indicators you would use to examine the health of a housing market?
Yeah. So one of the sort of obvious ways in which our housing markets and systems are not working is that typically, economists believe that when the demand for a good or service increases, that the supply will respond and build more of it, right? So if people want to buy more blue cars, then the industry will produce more blue cars. When people shift from eating beef to eating chicken, meat producers shift over to producing more chicken. And this is one of the obvious ways that housing markets don't work. We observe a lot of neighborhoods and even entire metro areas where there's clearly demand for more housing. People want to live, places that have great jobs, great public schools, lots of economic opportunity. Tons of people would like to live there, and they're just not building that much housing. And this is both at kind of the metro level and down to neighborhoods within cities. So, this is one of the sort of biggest problems, that we just don't build enough homes where people want to live. Markets by themselves will also adjust to kind of niches and different types of demand. So it's not that the market by itself only wants to build $1 million single family homes on 2-acre lots, right? There are only so many people who want to buy that product. There are lots of people who would like to live in smaller homes. One of the fastest growing population segments is actually one-person households. So we'd expect markets to produce, studio apartments for one-person households and big homes for big families. So kind of meeting the demands of people at different incomes and preferences and household types. And we see this not just in something like new construction, but examples of like an older Victorian house that was built for a very big family with a couple of servants then gets subdivided into individual rooms because there's demand for smaller units, right? So we see lots of ways that markets are very flexible and accommodating as long as we don't create rules that stop it from doing that. And then sort of the final piece of what a healthy housing system would look like, we shouldn't have homeless people. So, a market where there are people who are unhoused and living on the streets is unhealthy in pretty much every possible way, right? For society, for public health, for the regional economy. That's not something that the market probably is going to address on its own very well, because there's some subset of people who are just too poor to afford the operating costs of housing. And so that's a place where government is going to have to step in and provide subsidies, but you get a healthier community and a healthier environment when we provide subsidies so that everybody has a decent place to live.
And so one thing you discuss in the book is the importance of thinking about housing as a regional system, and that regional markets should produce enough additional housing to meet increases in demand is driven by population and job growth. And I think one thing that we hear like locally is kind of thinking about what are Chapel Hill and Carrboro's obligations to build housing, because one answer that we often hear is, well, the demand for housing is somewhere else, or all the housing can be in a community that's not ours, but nearby. So how do we determine kind of what our fair share of affordable housing should be?
Yeah, I mean, if we allowed the market to build where it wanted to build, we wouldn't have to come up with numbers and assign them. You would observe that particularly in places where land is very expensive, then you would get vertical housing, denser housing, so more homes on a small piece of land to conserve on housing costs. And so you would essentially see where the market wants to build housing, it would build more. And that's going to be in places like Chapel Hill and Carrboro. So, close to job centers and close to good transportation infrastructure, neighborhoods that have a lot of amenities. So good public schools, lots of parks and open space, right? We know the kinds of places that people want to live. Trying to figure out an exact number for each community in a region is sort of an artificial exercise that we have to go through when places essentially are opting out of this, right? So the better option is don't put in place barriers and allow the market to sort of drive, how much gets built where. It's not that every community necessarily is going to have housing at every price point or income point, right? Because some places just have really expensive land and a limited amount of that, they're going to be more expensive. But every community should have housing at some range of incomes, right? And one of the things that we observe about, our things like single family exclusive zoning is that they prohibit the ability to build different structure types of different sizes. Some places, it's particularly hard to build rental housing. And so then you get artificially a less diverse community than you would have otherwise, and not enough overall.
Yeah. And so one thing you also discuss in the book is this question of housing affordability. And you look at it from two perspectives. So one's about supply, which I think people are happy to talk about. But then the other side is kind of increasing incomes and other supports for poor households. And I think the challenge that we have in North Carolina and like similar states in the Southeast is that we don't have much support at the state level for poor households. So what options do we have? Like, could we consider some sort of universal basic income? I know Durham is trying that out in various kind of at a very small scale. Or are there other strategies you could think about to kind of boost incomes for poor households?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say that everywhere in the country essentially struggles with this problem, that the poorest 20% of households in essentially every city, every metro area, every state can't afford market rate housing in their community because incomes are too low. So this is not just a problem in places where housing is expensive or where there aren't policies to support income. The economist's sort of preferred way to deal with this is to give people cash in as simple a form as possible. So poor households, for instance, in 1 month, they need to pay the rent. In the next month, their car breaks down, you have to repair it so you can keep your job. Then you have a health expenditure. For middle income and high income households, we just use the cash to pay for what we need at any given point, realizing that our expenses are going to change over time. We don't do that for poor households. We tend to give them in-kind assistance. So you might get a housing voucher and you get food stamps and you get subsidized health care, but that's not fungible. You can't move those sort of across buckets as you need to, right? So the ideal would just be, give everybody cash, something like a universal basic income. We have trouble sort of figuring out what level a universal basic income should be and whether it's a top up on existing programs or would substitute for them. So those are really important questions in policy design. Housing vouchers are the most effective housing subsidy program we have. The federal government essentially picks up the cost of rent above 30% of somebody's income, which works really nicely in markets that have adequate apartments. So people can find an apartment, the federal government picks up the tab. It's a very straightforward transfer. And we know that vouchers are incredibly helpful in stabilizing households, including families with kids, and allowing them to go to school and not worry about being evicted or having to move. The problem is that the federal government doesn't provide vouchers for everybody who qualifies. About 1 in 4 poor households gets any federal rental assistance. So what we've essentially done is, because the federal government isn't picking up its fair share of the tab, state and local governments wind up trying to patch together other things, which is much harder to do, right? So poor communities have the greatest need for help, but also the least resources to provide them. Rich communities look like they don't have a lot of people who need housing assistance because they've priced out all of the poor people, and the only people who live there are pretty affluent already. At the state level, it would still make more sense to provide something that looks like cash. Some states actually do have voucher programs, and some affluent local governments have voucher programs to top up the federal one. That's sort of a tricky one to do, because if one locality offers a voucher program and the surrounding ones don't, then it encourages people to move to the place with more generous assistance. And so typically we think that sort of moving to a higher level of government is better for anti-poverty programs of all kinds.
Great. So I wanted to move the conversation a bit to thinking about zoning and entitlement. So in Chapel Hill and Carrboro, we have relatively restrictive zoning, and then we use kind of conditional use. A developer comes and wants to build something. The town council says, we'll make an exception for you, but only if you provide affordable housing. It can take years for that kind of process to be completed. And I guess the question is like, would we be better off kind of increasing the speed at which developments are approved and then just use the increased tax revenues to support affordable housing? Or does this kind of inclusionary zoning kind of process have merits that we should also consider?
You would absolutely be better off allowing more development to happen quickly and then coming up with sort of a dedicated funding stream to pay for affordable housing. I think a lot of people who haven't worked in real estate don't realize how much the time to complete a project matters for the cost of the project, right? So development is something where the costs are all front loaded. You buy the property, you have to pay for the zoning, for the environmental impact statement and so forth, do the actual construction, and it takes a while until you start getting revenues when the units come online. The discretionary development process, where there's this sort of back and forth negotiation between the local government and the developer, often between multiple agencies in the local government, the water and sewer is one and building is another. This extends the time required to complete the process, which makes it more expensive, and that gets translated into higher rents and prices for the finished housing. So making a shorter process that's less uncertain, that's more clear and rules-based, would bring down the cost of new housing, right? So you could get more housing online faster and at a lower cost. There are a number of ways to create sort of a dedicated revenue stream that could be used either for something like vouchers or to subsidize construction. Probably the best way to do this is just an increase in property taxes, because that covers then a wide base. So everybody pays a little bit more in property taxes that goes into a pool of funds that can be used, for instance, to acquire an older apartment building and make sure that it stays affordable. Increasing property taxes is not the most politically popular thing for elected officials. So a lot of places have used either inclusionary zoning or impact fees, both of which are essentially a tax on new development. So it makes new development more expensive. It doesn't apply to existing homes. So you're letting your current residents off the hook, but then that also adds to the price of new housing. And so the new market rate housing will be more expensive than it has to, right? Even something like a real estate transfer tax. So every time a property is sold, it generates some revenue and could go into a dedicated fund. That that would still be better than income tax, than impact fees, because at least it affects the sale of both new homes and existing homes rather than everything being piled onto the new construction.
So one thing that we've heard a lot about, I'm sure here and elsewhere, is missing middle housing. And what's happened, I think, is that we changed zoning to allow middle housing, but it's not producing enough development. So could you talk a bit about kind of challenges in building middle housing, and beyond zoning reform, what else should communities be looking at to encourage the development of middle housing types?
Yeah, so we can think both of kind of a couple of things on the regulatory side beyond zoning, and then on the market factors. It's important to think about not just zoning, like are you allowed to build a duplex or a quad or something, but all of the other rules that go with that. So for instance, it's often if you build a duplex, you have to have water and sewer hookups that accommodate a larger piece of property, right? So that's more expensive. Or something like, building height caps. It's worth it to build a fourplex if you can build maybe a 3-story building, but if you're capped at a 2-story, then effectively it's not going to be profitable to do. So it's sort of the, minimum parking requirements are a great example. So, if you legalize missing middle housing by technically allowing it in structure type, but have all of these other rules that make it financially not feasible to do, those other regulations need to be changed as well. And that's often a sort of an iterative process of figuring out what the pain points are. But even if you get all the regulations right, there are a couple of reasons why, all over the US, we don't build a lot of missing middle housing. Some of it is because development has gone very much towards large developers who do large development to take advantage of economies of scale. Duplexes, triplexes, those are really attractive for smaller developers who may only do a handful of them and work in a market, right? Many of those developers don't exist because they've been priced out of the very costly, long, complicated projects that you're allowed to do. We haven't developed targeted finance products for this either, right? So we have mortgages for single family homes to be bought. We have mortgages, construction loans, and then acquisition loans for big properties, right? But the sort of the 2 to 4 space is not something where there's necessarily a specialized product. We don't have as many architects who design buildings like that because we haven't built it. So, it's really interesting if you go to a city like Richmond, Virginia, you can see that there was a point in time where they built 2, 4, and 6 unit buildings, just like rolled them off the factory floor. I mean, they built, hundreds of these things in the same time period. They're basically identical, right? They have the same design, very efficient sort of mass production of these missing middle, but we have gone away from doing that. We've made them illegal, and we've also lost the infrastructure to do that as just sort of a quick product that has kind of a set prototype that you can replicate.
I think to pick up on this, so ADUs are allowed in most of Chapel Hill, but no one's building them. So if you're thinking about how do you diagnose this problem, where do you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a bunch of places have gone through this. So sort of ADUs are now legal. Why isn't anybody building them? It's definitely worth it to look at these sort of adjacent rules. So the District of Columbia, where I live, technically allows ADUs, but they have a minimum height of 10 feet. A lot of the ADUs are actually the basement of row houses, and most of them don't have a 10-foot ceiling. Scooping out enough land to make a 10-foot ceiling is really expensive, and so nobody does that, right? Parking requirements are a big one. If you can build an ADU, but you have to have an off-street parking space, that almost always makes it not financially feasible to do. In some cases, they're limited to in occupants. So the only people who can live there are related by blood or marriage to the person who lives in the main house. That makes this less attractive as a rental property. Not that many people have, family members to move in. So all of this kind of stuff I would look at. The other question is probably how many other places in North Carolina allow ADUs. So California went through about 10 or 11 years of tweaking all of these rules to make ADUs actually work and have consistent rules across the whole state. Once they got to that point, an industry basically formed to make pre-built ADUs and plop them down on your lot, right? So the design, the hookups to utilities, the construction, that's all standardized at a large enough scale. They're just companies that build nothing but ADUs. They will help you get the permit. They will figure out how to do this. They will come and put it on the foundation. Once it gets to a scale, it's worth it to respond and build the infrastructure. If Chapel Hill allows ADUs and nobody else in North Carolina does, there's not that much an incentive to develop in the expertise.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to switch now to thinking about transportation and equity, and I really like the way that your book brings in those larger issues. So to start with, Sunbelt states like North Carolina have historically achieved relatively affordable housing by pushing new housing to cheap land far from city centers. So how does climate change affect how we should think about where we encourage new housing to be developed?
We should build fewer homes in the exurbs, in places that are very car dependent, places that are exposed to high climate risk, and then have a high household carbon footprint. So we can think about sort of a couple pieces of this. We tend to focus on the commute, right? If you build homes that are really far away from job centers, people have to commute long distances. But the other piece of that is actually that most trips are not home to work. It's things like going to the grocery store and dropping off and picking up your kids. The very low density suburbs and exurbs, you can't get anywhere from your house without getting into a car, right? And to get from your house to the grocery store involves a 25-minute drive on a couple of highways. So both building homes closer to jobs and transit infrastructure and also making it easier to build complete communities. So you have housing, you have retail, you have basic entertainment and services, including that with sidewalks and bike lanes so that people can at least do their daily errands and socializing without having to get into a car. All of that stuff would help. The other piece that I'm sure is on the mind in North Carolina, we have built an awful lot of homes along coastlines and along rivers that have that periodic flooding. Flooding is going to become more frequent and more severe over time with climate change. And so at some point we have to stop building homes in places that we know are going to be underwater or on fire on a regular basis.
So in recent years, there's a proposed light rail system in the Triangle that fell through. It ended up not getting funded or kind of being advanced. Chapel Hill is now planning a bus rapid transit line, but it's not clear that there's political will to build densely enough to support the bus service. So could you talk about the intersection of density and transit, and what are the benefits of building more densely to support transit?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a classic chicken and egg problem. If you have a dense corridor where lots of people live or that has lots of jobs and commercial activity, then you have built-in riders for it, right? So transit works basically by having a large volume of people who are within the walk shed of the transit station, so up to maybe a half mile or so. If you put a commuter rail into a suburban area that has mostly low-density single-family homes, there aren't that many people who can walk to a station. You don't have enough riders there. So the question is, do we add transit service to places where housing already exists and is fairly dense, or to serve job corridors, or do we increase the density around transit corridors? And we should be doing both of these, and they need to be coordinated, which is one of the problems that typically the agency that has control over funding and planning of transit infrastructure doesn't have any authority over sort of land use and zoning and housing planning. So ideally, you'd want to do both of those. Changing zoning, the market will take a while to respond. So, if you have a planned BRT corridor and you upzone around it, you're not overnight going to have enough people living there that they can walk to it and support it. It's going to take probably 3 to 5 years at least before you start getting more of that. So one question is whether the BRT, if it can connect nodes already, that's really helpful. And we know that connecting job centers is really important because there are already lots of people who work in a condensed area. Providing better transit from where housing already exists to those job nodes can be a good kind of first step.
Great. So this is a tough question. So downtown Chapel Hill is ripe for increased density, but in terms of zoning, if you look at it, it's effectively an island. So bordered on 3 sides by the university in predominantly white historic districts, and on the 4th side by a historically Black neighborhood that's threatened by gentrification. So when thinking about building more housing, how do we balance equity and these aesthetic or kind of historic considerations with the need to house current and future residents who want to live in our community?
Yeah, this is such a tough question. I will say that one of the strongest arguments for doing a citywide upzoning is that that's the best way to protect lower income neighborhoods from sort of a lot of intense development and gentrification and displacement. I live in the District of Columbia, and there's sort of a classic example of having done this wrong. The entire northwest quadrant of the city is really wealthy and mostly white. You can't build anything but single family homes. So they've added virtually no additional housing over the last 20 years. The neighborhoods that have gotten a ton of development are sort of just outside there, adjacent to it. So a number of the historically Black communities that didn't fight against housing, but that were very close to some of these more affluent areas or to downtown, have gotten just a huge amount of development, and stuff that was there before got torn down and replaced. So, the best way to protect low-income Black and brown communities from displacement is to build your housing in places that are already wealthy and white, right? Which is, some of the places that market wants to build anyway. University towns are in a kind of a peculiar situation because often a lot of the land is owned by an institution that doesn't necessarily respond to the market, that doesn't do development. Universities should be thinking hard about building enough student housing on campus, preferably or close to campus, because students can outbid low-income workers for housing that's adjacent to campus, and they will if there isn't housing provided for them. Most universities have done a terrible job of building enough dorms or university-owned apartments to absorb students, but that would be something really helpful that Chapel Hill could do.
Great. So 2 final questions before we get to the lightning round. So there appears to be a real momentum behind pro-housing and kind of a YIMBY groups, if we want to use that term. What do you think is driving this, and what can these groups to be more effective?
So higher housing costs are one of the big drivers. Many of the pro-housing groups, I don't know what the demographics are of Next, but many of them are younger households, people in their 20s and 30s, for whom homeownership seems really difficult. And I'm a Gen Xer. When I came out of college, it was pretty easy to get a well-paid job. And if you wanted to, probably within 5 or 6 years of finishing college, you could buy a house in a decent neighborhood. That is pretty much out of reach for most young, even college graduates who are more affluent than the average person. So there is a lot of frustration that the housing systems, this whole set of you should buy a house to build wealth, you should move to a nice neighborhood with good public schools, right? These rules just don't work for a lot of younger households. And so people are really frustrated about that and are venting their frustration by getting engaged in the political process. This is actually one of the things that gives me some optimism, that I think there is enough frustration and anger that the system is broken. It is very heavily stacked towards people who bought homes 20 or 30 years ago, older households, the status quo. And that's fine for them, but there are an awful lot of people who are looking for more affordable places to live, more walkable communities, and they're really frustrated that we've created these arbitrary policies that make that impossible.
And then finally, before the lightning round, are there small cities that are making good progress in addressing barriers to housing? So we're about 60,000 people in Chapel Hill and 20 in Carrboro. In particular, looking for cities kind of outside the Northeast and the West Coast, which we hear a lot about.
Yeah. So I would say that there are places that historically have kept housing pretty cheap by building a lot, and most of the Sun Belt falls into that category. So these are, sort of larger metro areas. But if you look at, the Nashvilles and Austins and Denvers of the world, they have historically been pretty affordable given the kinds of jobs that they have. They are running into the limits of that strategy. We'll say that there are a bunch of college towns that are very similar to Chapel Hill. So I talked to a group earlier this spring in Charlottesville. They're going through a rewrite of their comprehensive plan and their zoning plan and doing it very thoughtfully, trying to address some of these questions. How do we make sure we're providing financial support for long-term renters who are not part of the university community, but really should not be priced out of it? How do we think about doing strategically zoning reforms along with providing some dedicated funding streams? There are a lot of places that are having these same conversations. There isn't one easy template to fix all places, right? Sort of what land you have, what you can build on it, what your development community is like, where your biggest housing needs are, those are going to be a little bit different. And so it's worth looking at some data and trying to plan out what works for your community. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my work is identify kind of groups of places that have similar problems and figure out kind of suggested guidelines that could work for a bunch of places. So, Chapel Hill and Charlottesville and Ithaca and Ann Arbor are all kind of dealing with these questions and could really benefit from talking to one another, seeing what you're trying, both on the policy side, but also on the politics. What works to do more organizing? How do you persuade your elected officials that these are policy changes you need to engage in? I think that's actually the piece that we know the least about, is how to do the political organizing and get stuff enacted.
So I guess turning to that, we'll go with this lightning round. So these are a set of common claims or myths, we could call them, that we often hear to kind of counter some of the things that we argue for in our group and others. So I'll run through these and again, give you 30 seconds or so to respond to each one. So the first, we should build more housing, but only if it is 100% affordable.
Any new housing is better than not building new housing. If you build it, you can give people vouchers to get in, but housing that doesn't get built means more competition.
We should build more housing, but only for home buyers, not renters.
Renters are people too. Renters need places to live, right? We have this deep social stigma against renters, which is kind of crazy because everybody is a renter at some point in their life. And we should be building opportunities for people at all stages of their life, both renters and owners.
So even though several large new apartment buildings have opened in recent years, rents continue to go up. This proves that adding supply doesn't lower the cost of housing.
Think about the counterfactual. If you hadn't built any new housing, rents would be even higher than they are today.
All the new apartments are luxury apartments, which are not affordable and encourage landlords of older apartments to raise their rents.
So we actually have some good emerging research that in places where new apartments get built, the rents of older existing buildings actually go down. And so building new luxury apartments for rich people is going to make things easier for lower income residents who already live in the neighborhood.
There are many vacant apartments in the new apartment buildings. Developers don't care if the units sit empty because they only build them to sell to investors.
So the investor thing is a real myth. Even in places like Vancouver and San Francisco that have a lot of investor activity, it's a tiny, tiny share of the overall housing stock. And even if investors from outside the US are going to buy the homes, by and large, they're going to rent them out to have somebody in them.
When it comes to addressing climate change, it's more important to protect trees from being cut down than it is to build apartment buildings.
No, it's more important to build apartments in places that are close to jobs and transit. Otherwise, we wind up building housing in the least climate-friendly places available.
And then finally, developers are greedy, and we shouldn't reward their greed by giving them control over valuable land, at least not with securing community benefits from them in return for allowing them to build.
Who built your house, right? Most of us live in homes that were built by for-profit developers. That's always been the case. Also, nonprofit developers still have to collect enough money in rent to cover their operating costs. So if you care about the well-being of poor people, trying to keep greedy developers from making money is actually serving them very, very badly.
Terrific. So now we have time for questions from the audience, and I'll see if any are up. So Jeff Green, do you want to, or I see Melody has her hand raised, so I can ask her to unmute.
Hello, it's nice to meet you. I really enjoy your Twitter feed. I'm curious about communications campaigns that you've seen nationwide, and kind of talk about things that you have seen that have brought people into this world. And I'm also curious in a completely different vein. We have a town council, and then we have these like 18 advisory boards, and oftentimes the plan, I believe, is to like run with the clock and, you know, have more meetings, more advisory boards, delay, and until the town council makeup is not amenable to development. And those are the advisory boards and town council are like two different timelines. And I'm just curious if you could talk about any communities in the US that have kind of reconciled those things.
Yeah. So in the communication strategy first, I actually think one of the strengths of the pro-housing movement is that the communications and outreach and political organizing is often very local, and I think it needs to be, right? So like the arguments that work in the Bay Area aren't necessarily the same arguments that are going to work in Chapel Hill. Some places have leaned into, so Minneapolis leaned very hard into a racial equity framework when they did their rezoning, in part because they have an enormous racial wealth gap between Black and white households and white and Native households. And that was a sensitive subject, so they really leaned into that. Utah has just passed some fairly aggressive statewide zoning, and they did not do this on either a racial equity, primarily on a racial equity strategy or economic equity. They were leaning on, in part, kind of a business-friendly argument that not building enough housing makes it hard to hire and retain workers, and so this is an economic development strategy. they're also very sensitive to the fact that they don't have a ton of water. And so compact development is really important to make the best use of the water they have. So, I would say there are a bunch of different arguments you can use. Racial and economic equity should carry weight in progressive communities, although sometimes it doesn't as much as we'd like, right? Climate can work in places where that's a high level issue. I think probably, maybe not necessarily in Chapel Hill, but in North Carolina more broadly, kind of business and economic competitiveness, this is good for the regional economy, should bring over some people, including potentially groups, besides the real estate industry, but business groups, right? So like Chamber of Commerce type groups care about the fact that it's expensive for them to hire and retain workers. So, I would definitely encourage you to sort of figure out the soft spots for the people that you're talking to, putting together a coalition, right? The hard part is that you often wind up with a coalition of traditional affordable housing advocates, kind of pro-housing economic efficiency, maybe some climate people, maybe some business groups who don't normally talk to each other and trust each other, right? But piecing together the coalitions and building some trust and working around, kind of carefully articulated goals that you can all agree on, that seems to be more or less the winning formula. And on the Sorry, on the second question, remind me quickly what that was.
It was on advisory board. Like we have a ton of advisory boards and it just feels like it pads out the process.
Yeah.
Timelines are extended. Oftentimes the appointment procedure for advisory boards is very opaque, and people who know how to kind of work the system and have been around a while are advocating for people who align with their points of view on these advisory boards, which require a lot of time in the evening and are not easy for, I have a 1-year-old and 3-year-old, they're 3 and 5 now, but I could never join one of those like that. Yeah. I can't take the time to do that.
Yeah, so there are a couple pieces there. So a bunch of cities have something like an advisory group. Often they are elected, and so it'll happen concurrent with city council elections, and run for the same time period. It's a little unusual that you would have advisory groups that don't run with kind of political appointees or elected officials. So that one I haven't heard before. Say if you can sort of make the good government argument that just it should be more transparent, right? How people are chosen. Appointed positions aren't necessarily bad because it can then align with your elected officials and make them move together. But there should definitely be a transparent process that if you want to be part of this, that you can put your name in the hat. Sort of the larger issue of the whole housing approval process is so geared towards people who have free time to show up, for 5 hours on a Tuesday night and argue in favor of or against a development project. This is a continued exercise in time outside of like a day job and a family and whatever else. That's a really unfortunate way to run the approval process. So, the more places can move towards a by right system where there are clear rules, right? Getting community input at the stage of doing a comprehensive plan or doing a small area plan makes sense, but then don't require people to be engaged for every single project on a case-by-case basis. That's obviously for people who figured out how to work the system to their benefit. They would prefer it to remain opaque and a high barrier to participation. But that's also a really strong argument to say this is just not small d democratic, and your elected officials try to make the process more transparent and more accessible.
So now Jeff Green, I think, has a question.
It is.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for doing this. I'm actually walking around one of Chapel Hill's many single-family neighborhoods with lots of character. We are actually, Chapel Hill's undergoing a 4-year process to rewrite its development ordinances. And I'm curious if, you were advising an elected official who's going to have to vote on it, what are some of the sort of 3 key principles that you would suggest the code should incorporate, the updated code should incorporate to ensure that adequate housing is produced?
Yeah, so one is to make sure that there are provisions for a diverse range of housing types, because one of the biggest problems with our current system is that we set aside enormous amounts of land for single family detached homes and everything else is kind of fighting for space, right? And sort of just acknowledging that there's a continuum, single family homes on small lots, townhomes, duplexes, low rise apartments. like the more flexibility there is in different kinds of structure types, having that legal and then letting developers in the market figure out what structure type works with which parcel, flexibility on things like dimensional requirements so that you don't wind up not being able to use half of the lot. So flexibility in kind of the dimensional requirements, diversity in structure types, and really importantly, transparent rules-based systems for the process of approval, right? Shorter, simpler, transparent. Everybody knows what the process is. It's applied fairly to all projects, less discretion over approving or not approving or sort of squeezing extra fees out of developers on an individual project. Those are sort of some general principles that would help a lot. I will say the other thing is that it is very helpful for elected officials voting for better housing and zoning if they have visible and vocal support. So if only the NIMBYs are showing up and the pro-housing people are quiet, then it looks like everybody is a NIMBY, right? And so having a vocal campaign, letter writing, emails, letting elected officials know that there's a constituency for better policies makes it much easier for them to vote that way if they're inclined to. And if they're not, it makes them stop and think about, hey, there are actually a bunch of votes that are on the table that I could win over if I do this.
So next up, Penny.
Hi, thanks, Jenny. This is a great conversation. I just want to make a point that as you're speaking to us, there's only one current elected official in this conversation. That's the mayor of Hillsborough, Jen Weaver. I'm a former county commissioner, was also on the Chapel Hill Town Council. And I just want to take us back to your, in the beginning of the conversation when you talked about the transfer tax and impact fees. So the transfer tax has been on our ballot many, many times and it has failed. And I think it does fail is the reason it fails is because people don't understand what the transfer tax does. And then you have supporters or not supporters, but you have people against the transfer tax, as you just said, are vocally loud. And so people don't vote for it. The impact fees are a little bit closer to me because we lost our right for impact fees in Orange County while I was on the county commission. And one of the reasons we lost that is because of our local chamber of commerce, who was vested in business as opposed to whether it be schools or affordable housing. Our impact fee went for schools, but we lost that. So maybe you could talk a little bit. I know this is a tough one for you because you said it, but what is the political strategy besides having the vocal support, having the letters written, because we all do that all the time and we come up short. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what else can be done.
Yeah, so my general recommendation on this may or may not work in North Carolina. Some of the more promising reforms are actually coming from state governments that are pushing back on local governments who won't build enough housing, who have a lot of barriers. So Maine actually just passed a pretty ambitious statewide zoning reform that legalizes ADUs and duplexes statewide, and I believe also creates some incentives for moderately priced housing. The state can be very helpful in that way, on leaning on places that don't want to play ball, also in providing some financial assistance. So, it's easier to build housing if the state's picking up some of the tabs for schools and roads and things like that. I know that the North Carolina state politics is a little bit fraught at the moment. I still think that there's potential there, in part because Republicans in the state legislature might be okay spanking blue communities like Chapel Hill. And I would guess that probably some of the blue communities are the problem, although I'm sure that there are also red suburbs that are really exclusionary too. But if you have, there is at least one group that's pushing for statewide reform in Raleigh. So sort of identifying other jurisdictions that would find this helpful. Right. And one of the things that a statewide law does is provide political cover for local elected officials. So the state is requiring us to build X number of units of affordable housing. We have to put them somewhere. Is easier to push back against your residents than I, city council or mayor, am opposing this and you guys don't want it.
Great. Other questions? I can ask one while people think of things. I'm curious with this issue, to what degree has the research on housing affordability changed? And to what degree is it just the politics are different? So is it that it's always been the answer to build more housing has always been the same and we just have a different situation now? Or is it that we actually understand more about how housing affordability works and that's why we have these new solutions?
So that's a fun question. I wrote my dissertation on exclusionary zoning, anti-multifamily zoning in the Boston suburbs in 2006. And everything that I wrote in my dissertation is completely applicable today. So, I was not the first generation. Economists have been doing this for a long time. So in particular, sort of the very exclusionary large lot, single family zoning, complicated process, we have known for 30 years or more that that's bad for affordability. The politics have changed, and the politics have changed, I think, for a couple of reasons. So one thing that's happened is that really high housing costs have branched out from just the kind of big suburban metros. Some of the places with the highest increase in housing prices are Boise, Idaho, Salt Lake City, Austin's at the top of the list. Places like Nashville that have typically been pretty affordable, Allentown, Pennsylvania, these are places that have gotten much more expensive, much faster. And so there's a lot more national conversation and attention to this problem. The fact that we've gone through a decade of underbuilding nationally with very strong demand from household growth, right? We have the boomers and the millennials, right? Two historically large generations who are all trying to occupy housing, and we're not building enough, right? So this puts a lot more pressure on the economic side. There has also been a lot of strategic sort of organizing from a handful of groups. So California has the worst housing affordability. They also have kind of the biggest political movement around this. They actually have now two statewide groups, California YIMBY, which is sort of the policy organizing group, and then YIMBY Action, which is actually a 501c4. They're a political action committee organized in Sacramento. They sit in the legislator's office every single day and harass them about this stuff, right? So they are funded, right? So the tech industry in California has put a fair amount of money into the organizing side on the political side. So they've got lobbyists who are knocking on the doors in the state house and in a lot of cities and counties pushing for policy reform. I don't know that you guys are at the point of needing that yet, and that takes a lot of resources. But what we're talking about is policy change, and the way you get policy change is by lobbying elected officials and doing this systematically and persistently with resources. I think there is enough national interest, sort of general engagement, general conversation, lots of accessible research, right? So most of this is not buried in journals, right? Blog posts and, Twitter has been fantastic for letting housing advocates all over the country team up with one another, see what's going on in other places, learn about things and connect. Some of you guys are on Twitter, so I see you and talk to you, but that's really it. It's only been in the last 10 years or so that it's been that easy to figure out what's going on elsewhere and to pick up tips and try things.
I'll let Patrick now unmute.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
So great presentation, really appreciate all the knowledge you're sharing here today. One of the things that I guess we've been talking about here recently in Carrboro is, we have the possibility of maybe ending single family only zoning in Carrboro and expanding that to include duplexes. But there's also the concern that even if we do that, there are certain things like the building code versus the residential and commercial code that would make it harder for us to get, say, triplexes and quadplexes built in those neighborhoods today, even though we have a good deal of triplexes, quadplexes, and even there's an 11plex up the street from me. But both with the codes for residential and building, and then also things like setbacks. I know you mentioned parking requirements earlier, but are there design elements you see people changing in other communities that are really sort of unlocking new units above and beyond just saying we're going from single family zoning to now you can do up to 4 on a lot?
Yeah. So other than just the structures that are allowed, I would say parking requirements are probably the single biggest thing you can change, partly because parking is really, really expensive. So, structured parking costs $50,000 a space. Even service parking takes up a lot of land, requiring additional parking, and particularly, sort of requiring 2 off-street parking spaces for a 2-bedroom apartment is a lot of space and a lot of money. That can kill a project pretty quickly. In communities where there isn't great transit infrastructure, developers are still going to build parking because customers want it and they can't rent or sell the units without it. But very often the requirements make them build more parking than the market requires, and they could save money from doing that. Other than that, it's all the pieces, right? So, lot widths. Philadelphia allows really skinny lots. You can build a house on, I think, 13-foot lot, right? So you can build things like townhouses if you don't have the lot width requirements or side setback rules or things like that. Height matters a lot, probably not for fourplexes. Once you get to, say a 10-unit building, even things like the requirement for extra exits, right? So an apartment, so a lot of the older apartment buildings are around a single stair. Now they're required to have 2 exits for the building. That gets you pretty quickly into a double loaded corridor with stairs or elevators at either end. That's a much less efficient floor plan. More of the space is unused and unrentable. So all of this stuff, and that's part of the complicated thing, that there are whole sets of rules that interact with one another. Changing one little piece of it doesn't fix the others. But sitting down with architects and developers who've gone through this process and ask them, sort of think of it like a prototype, right? If you wanted to be able to build triplexes everywhere, what are all of the things that you would need to be able to check off to make this work? And what are the rules that are preventing that from happening? And then make sure that all of this gets done as a package.
Here's a question from Kyle. Actually, let's have Jen Weaver, and then we'll go to Kyle's question. The mayor of Hillsborough.
Hi, Mayor of Hillsborough, who has not gotten herself good lighting in 2.5 years of home meetings. Sorry, I do have a face. So thank you so much for all of this. And you've touched on, in the lightning round, you touched briefly on the, 100% affordable scenario versus not. Can you say a little bit about situations where, requiring some affordable housing with a market rate project, and that can be in terms of inclusionary zoning specifically, but this really comes up a lot in just general negotiating. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I've done a fair amount of research on inclusionary zoning, and I will say that the vast majority of programs across the US have built very, very, very small amounts of affordable housing. So it's not my favorite program just because it doesn't add additional housing. Even if it's carefully designed, there's a potential for it to discourage market rate housing or drive up the cost of that. But the fundamental problem is it just doesn't build that many affordable units. The places where it has worked and built the most have given pretty substantial density bonuses, and they have to be places where rents are high enough that you can absorb that. So, Montgomery County, Maryland has one of the oldest programs. They built quite a lot in the 70s and 80s, and their production has really tailed off because they sort of used up the easy projects where you can squeeze in the affordable units and share the cost over a fairly large project. San Diego has an interesting, they have it's a voluntary program, but it's a substantial density bonus. So I want to say something like, if you include 10 to 15% affordable units, you get a 30% density bonus, and they will actually go up from there. That's a very supply constrained high rent city, and developers would kill to get a 30 to 50% density bonus. So they're often able to make that work. But it has to be the right kind of market circumstances for that to work out. my tendency is to want a dedicated pot of funds for affordable housing that can be used for something like acquisition of existing properties, right, which is generally much cheaper than new construction. New construction is just, it's really expensive. And so trying to do new construction, bring down the rents enough that low-income people can live there without giving them a voucher or something else, just, it's really hard. There's a big gap there. And so it's hard to make those deals pencil, but having a fund where you can acquire existing older buildings, maybe do some rehab, even things like small dollar subsidies to low-income homeowners to fix up their properties, right? So that they, aren't swamped by utilities costs and property taxes, right? Those are just, they're a more efficient use of funding than trying to squeeze out new construction.
Great. I think the last two questions will be Kyle and then John. So Kyle, do you want to ask yours?
Oh, sure. I think a pro-housing coalition here that will be able to sustain kind of pushes, including they'll be able to sustain this push will probably have to include kind of the tenants' rights and social housing crowd. And there's been a lot of ink spilled over such coalitions becoming fractured in places like California. Have you seen productive mixes of policy positions and messaging that can keep those coalitions together?
Yeah, so kind of close to your situation, Charlottesville, Virginia is going through this comprehensive plan and zoning rewrite. The group Livable Charlottesville, which is their sort of very new and small local YIMBY group, has partnered with the Piedmont Housing Coalition, which is sort of the local affiliate of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So that's an affordable housing developer and tenant right advocate that's been in the business for a long time. They've been around. And Livable Charlottesville was very, very strategic about reaching out to them early, figuring out what it is they want out of this. They are recommending an inclusionary zoning program because Piedmont Housing wants it. I will say that there's what's the policy package that works, and then what's the package of policies that will get your political coalition together and hold them together. If something like inclusionary zoning brings on some partners and helps you get the broader zoning through, I would say go for that, and then try to make sure that the design of the program is as helpful as possible. Tenants' rights, there are a bunch of different things that fall under that. Some of them are like rent control is usually not that helpful for affordability. I think probably in North Carolina, you can't do it anyway, but things like just cause eviction and more communication between tenants, providing tenant representation. These are things that are perfectly reasonable to do. And if you can support those and bring on other groups online, I would absolutely recommend you to do it.
Great. And then finally, John Mitchell has a question.
Jenny, thanks for being here, and thanks for writing the book, which I found really informative. When a town shifts toward a more rule-based zoning regime, just procedurally, like, for example, form-based code, how does it promote complete communities? A part of our town, Chapel Hill, has a form-based code, and it's produced a lot of new housing. But a lot of folks think that the result was more quantity over quality and didn't result in placemaking or necessarily the mix of uses and proximity to each other that some folks would like to see in order for the community to function in a certain way. Is it a matter of having more thoughtful and nuanced rules that vary by block, or putting in the amenities using public dollars first and then unleashing the market? How do we control for placemaking instead of just having quantity over quality?
Yeah, I mean, the placemaking that's a tough element often to weave into zoning, even to something like a form-based code, because it's not just a matter of sort of what you're allowed to build, but it does also require then some funding to go into that. And I would say, don't expect the zoning code to do all of the work of making communities, right? So there are other kinds of rules around infrastructure and sidewalk widths and so forth. There are other parts of planning that are outside of zoning that can help do the work on that. And some of that is going to be sort of matching funds. So, if you build a large subdivision, you can require the developer to set aside some amount of his open space, but the developer has to pay for the costs of doing landscaping and upkeep and so forth. When you're doing small infill projects, it's, sometimes there's an opportunity to do a pocket park as part of that, but sometimes not. And so trying to write in regulations around that is likely to be hard. I will say that I'm a fan of using small area plans or neighborhood plans below the city level. So having the neighborhood come together to envision, we know that we need to have more housing and more diverse housing, but also we'd really like to have a park. We want the park to be a dog park, or we want it to be a playground for kids, or we want to have, bike space. That is the kind of thing where the planning process pre-zoning code is a chance to come up with an affirmative vision, a positive vision of what you want in the community, including the amenities. Then, the question is sort of writing the zoning code that enables that to happen, and if necessary, also providing public resources to pay for it, right? So zoning is not the only tool in the toolbox, and I would say make sure the zoning isn't blocking stuff that you want to have, but also think about the other tools besides zoning that can help.
Makes sense. Thank you.
So I think with that, we are out of time. I wanted to remind you, we're going to have a discussion on Dr. Schuetz's book on Thursday at 4. I'll put the link in the chat and I'll send it to you as well. And then also in July, we'll be hosting another event titled Equitable Government Advisory Boards and You, a conversation with data. So we'll be sharing data from the UNC Center for Civil Rights Project on inclusive planning boards. So visit our website to learn more. And again, we would really appreciate a donation to support events like this going forward. So thanks again, Dr. Schuetz, for this wonderful conversation, and we will see you soon.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.